Movies and TV shows often portray medieval castles as luxurious havens for the noble class. We imagine grand halls filled with elegant lords and ladies, indulging in lavish feasts and swirling in beautiful gowns. Beyond the glamour, the real deal. While the nobility enjoyed a more privileged existence, even their lives were far from idyllic. For the majority of castle inhabitants, the servants, soldiers and labourers, life was an endless cycle of hard work, meagre rations and cramped living conditions. It's time to peel back the layers of romanticised fiction and delve into the real lives of those who lived and worked within the imposing walls of medieval castles. The stench of reality, no plumbing, no escape. Imagine a world without flushing toilets, running water, or even the concept of a sewer system. The absence of plumbing meant that waste disposal was a constant and unpleasant challenge. Castles relied on cesspits, essentially giant holes dug into the ground to collect human waste. These pits were often located beneath the latrines, filling the air with a pungent aroma that permeated the entire structure. It's no wonder that medieval people were known for their liberal use of perfume, when they could get it, and their generally pungent odour. A world without showers, baths, disease and prayer. In medieval times, bathing was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then, it was an infrequent event. Without running water, filling a bathtub was a laborious process that involved hauling buckets of water from a well or nearby river. For the vast majority of castle residents, particularly the servants and labourers, bathing was simply not an option. This lack of personal hygiene contributed to the generally unsanitary conditions of castle life and made body odour an unavoidable aspect of daily interactions. Imagine the smell of a crowded marketplace, and then imagine that smell amplified within the confined walls of a castle. Privacy? What privacy? Forget about private bathrooms with fluffy towels and scented candles. In a medieval castle, if nature called, you were in for a communal experience. The latrine, often located in a turret or jutting out from the castle wall, served as the designated restroom for multiple people at once. Picture a long wooden bench with several holes carved into it, offering little to no privacy. Men and women, lords and servants, all shared the same facilities, often engaging in conversation or gossip while attending to their business. It was simply a fact of life, and no one seemed to bat an eyelash at the lack of privacy. A castle full of souls, more residents than rats? Almost. Forget those sprawling castle layouts, the reality was far more intimate and crammed. Castles housed a small army of servants, cooks, guards and workers. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, shared spaces not designed for modern living. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Servants often slept communally, sometimes with livestock. The line between work and personal life was non-existent. Extended family members added to the bustling population. Horses, dogs, chickens and cows were part of the scene. Dungeons of despair, torture, rats, and the fear factor. We've all heard tales of castle dungeons, dark, dank cells where prisoners languished in misery. Dungeons weren't just for holding prisoners, they were often stages for brutal acts of torture, designed to extract confessions or simply inflict pain on enemies. One particularly horrific method involved rats. The torturers would place a cage containing a rat on the victim's bare chest and then slowly heat the cage. Driven by desperation, the rat would gnaw its way through the victim's flesh to escape the heat. Living with vermin when rats were the Malibu of the Middle Ages. Rats were as much a part of castle life as knights and nobles, though decidedly less glamorous. Castles, with their abundance of food scraps, dark corners, and generally unhygienic conditions, were essentially rodent paradises. They were everywhere. In the kitchen, scurrying underfoot in the Great Hall, even nesting in the walls and rafters. Seeing a rat wasn't a cause for alarm. It was as commonplace as spotting a pigeon in a modern city square. But these weren't just cute little critters, they were harbingers of disease. Rats were notorious carriers of the plague, also known as the Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, wiping out a significant portion of the population. Liquid courage drowning sorrows in ale and wine. Given the less than ideal living conditions, it's no surprise that alcohol flowed freely in medieval castles. It wasn't just about pleasure. It was a social lubricant, a coping mechanism, and sometimes the only thing that made the day bearable. For the lords and ladies, fine wines and imported spirits were a sign of status and wealth. They held elaborate feasts where goblets overflowed, and toasting to one's health wasn't just a polite gesture. It was practically a survival strategy. Ale, brewed from fermented grains, was a staple beverage, often safer to drink than water. It provided much-needed calories and hydration, making it an essential part of the medieval diet, especially for those engaged in physical labor. A drink for survival when water was the enemy. We often take clean, drinkable water for granted. Rivers and wells, often the primary sources of water, were easily contaminated. Animal waste, sewage, and even corpses could find their way into the water supply, turning a simple drink into a gamble with one's health. So people turned to a safer alternative: alcoholic beverages. The fermentation process killed off harmful bacteria, making ale a surprisingly healthy choice. Sunrise, not booze rise. The servant's sobering reality. While it's tempting to imagine a castle full of perpetually tipsy residents stumbling around in a drunken haze, the reality was far more disciplined, at least for the majority of inhabitants. For the servants who kept the castle running, dawn meant work, not another round of ale. Their days were long and arduous, filled with back-breaking labour, from hauling water and chopping wood to scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots. Alcohol was a reward, not a right. Stone, cold and cramped, the unforgiving architecture. Castles were built to withstand sieges, not to provide cosy living spaces. The imposing stone walls that offered protection from enemies also trapped cold and dampness, making for a rather chilly abode. Imagine drafty corridors, damp stone floors, and walls that seemed to sweat in the winter. Fireplaces, while providing some warmth, did little to heat the vast spaces within a castle. Windows, those coveted portals of light and ventilation, were small and few in number, primarily for defensive purposes. A feast for the senses and the rats, dining in the Great Hall. The Great Hall of a castle was more than just a dining room, it was the heart of the castle, a stage for feasts, celebrations, and even the occasional trial or political gathering. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the hall, where residents and guests gathered for meals. Seating arrangements were a carefully orchestrated affair, reflecting the strict social hierarchy of the time. The lord and lady, of course, occupied the most prominent positions at the high table, with honoured guests seated closer to them. Food, when plentiful, was a grand spectacle, but it was also a sensory overload: the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversations, and the ever-present aroma of food, smoke, and yes, those pesky rodents. The Great Divide. Meals fit for a lord and scraps for the rest. While the lord and lady dined on exotic spices, imported wines, and the choicest cuts of meat, the servants' meals were a decidedly more humble affair. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, cheese, porridge, and whatever scraps were left over from the noble's table. Meat, a luxury for the lower classes, was often served in the form of pies or pottages, where smaller scraps and less desirable cuts could be disguised. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal treats, and for much of the year, the servants' diet lacked essential vitamins and nutrients, making them more susceptible to illness. Ironically, the one thing the servants often had in greater abundance than their social superiors was alcohol. More than just feasts and finery, the burdens of power. Life for the lord and lady of the castle wasn't all lavish feasts and luxurious gowns. While they enjoyed a level of comfort and privilege unimaginable to their servants, their lives were also fraught with challenges and responsibilities. They were the heads of their domain, responsible for the well-being and security of everyone within their castle walls. They were constantly navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics, forging alliances, settling disputes, and defending their territory from rival lords and envious neighbours. Their days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. Perfume and prayers, the never-ending battle against filth. Even for the lord and lady, escaping the pervasive grime of medieval life was a constant struggle. While their chambers might have been more spacious and better furnished than those of their servants, the lack of proper sanitation and hygiene affected everyone within the castle walls. One of the more ingenious, if not entirely effective methods of combating the stench was the use of rushes. These fragrant reeds were scattered across the floors, acting as a sort of medieval air freshener. But like everything else in a medieval castle, rushes came with their own set of problems, becoming matted down with dirt, food scraps, and other unsavoury debris over time. In a world where disease, warfare, and hardship were constant companions, religion provided solace, structure, and a sense of hope for a better life after death. Castles, despite their often grim realities, were no exception. The presence of a chapel wasn't just an architectural flourish. It was a testament to the pervasive influence of faith in medieval life. Imagine the echoing chants of prayers, the scent of incense mingling with the ever-present dampness, the flickering candlelight illuminating the faces of those seeking solace or perhaps forgiveness for their sins. For the inhabitants of a castle, from the highest lord to the lowliest servant, the chapel offered a connection to something larger than themselves, a reminder of a world beyond the castle walls. As in every aspect of medieval life, hierarchy played a defining role in religious practice within the castle. The lord and lady, as the heads of their domain, occupied the most prominent positions in the chapel, often in a specially constructed gallery that literally elevated them above the rest of the congregation. Imagine looking up from your position on a rough-hewn wooden bench, your knees aching from the cold stone floor, to see the lord and lady gazing down from their cushioned seats, their finery a stark contrast to the simple garb of those below. It was a visual reminder of their status, a physical manifestation of the social order that permeated every aspect of castle life. This hierarchy wasn't just about appearances. The lord and lady often had their own private chaplain who catered to their spiritual needs, offering private masses, confessions, and guidance. From the lack of plumbing and the ever-present stench to the cramped living conditions and the constant threat of disease, life in a medieval castle was a far cry from romanticized images. We've dispelled the myths of chivalrous knights and fair maidens, revealing overflowing cesspits and rat-infested corridors. The glamorous facade is stripped away, showing the gritty truth beneath. Castles, for all their flaws, were marvels of engineering and architecture, testaments to the ingenuity of their builders. They served as centers of power, commerce, and culture, shaping the political and social landscapes of their time. The legacy of medieval castle life extends beyond the physical structures themselves. It's a legacy reflected in our language, our laws, and our understanding of history. The next time you encounter a castle, whether in person or in the pages of a book, remember the people who lived and worked within its walls. Their lives a testament to the enduring human spirit. So what do you think? Would you have thrived in a medieval castle, or would you have longed for the comforts of modern life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating glimpses into the past.